Andrew Woodburn, Managing Director at Woodburn Mann, Executive Search Consultants, joins us now. Good to have you, Andrew. I've been wanting to get you in for some time since this rash of acting appointments started, and let's start with that. State-owned companies, the SOCs, acting financial director, acting chairman, acting CEO, SABC, SAA, all those SA acronyms, ESCOM. Now, we have got Brian Molefe at last confirmed as chief executive, so that's something. But generally, this rash of actings is not good for anyone.
No. And certainly it's an affliction that unfortunately our state-owned sector suffers from immensely. You know, you never see this volume of acting appointments in the private sector or in fact in many other countries around the world. So certainly it affects the individual, it affects the organization, both at an overt level, the obvious things one would expect, and I always try and see things from both sides. So let's talk about the positive. So what's positive in acting? At the end of the day, first of all, an individual gets an opportunity either to test the seat, so to speak, and or in some cases be exposed to a level up. If it's somebody who's moved up or someone from the CFO role taking over an acting role as CEO, one gets an opportunity to see more than what you normally would. But that, unfortunately, is far outweighed by the negatives. And to a certain degree, I always feel sorry for the individuals who take over these roles because it's almost a poison chalice. Why, one might ask? The following reasons. First of all, an individual who takes over an acting role often doesn't have the mandate of a permanent appointment. So in actual fact, they're there with no teeth. And so what do you do with that? One either tries to hold step and just keep things afloat, but essentially you're on a road to nowhere until a permanent decision is made.
And also a big organization like that, by definition, there are big decisions to be made all the time.
Correct. And in some cases, they are promoted to what we call in the industry their level of incompetence. So they shouldn't have been there to begin with. And so in some cases, they may even exacerbate the problems. Certainly, it's not in their interests, or they don't necessarily have the depth or power to solve the problems. And why go to all that work when you may not be there to implement it or to deal with the outcomes later?
And just staying with the point of incompetence, we've seen also a lot of stories coming to the surface around individuals who don't have the qualifications to hold the positions where they're in. And I've always asked myself the question, where were the headhunters here? Are your services not necessarily used in state-owned enterprises? And that's because it's a lot of political appointments. And where the services are used, you actually have the ability to filter and make sure that all the paperwork is in place. Why is it that we have these issues in state-owned enterprises?
And one thinks particularly of the chief engineer at PRASA.
Correct.
I mean, this is a technical business. And he hadn't got the engineering degree.
So two things. I'm glad you asked the question, because certainly it comes to my mind. And we have worked, and I've personally worked for certain state-owned enterprises in the past. In fact, we've had over 20-year relationships with some, a lot less right now. So I'll tell you where the problem arrives. Is first and foremost, it's not a market-driven economy. So the board often reports to the minister. The board is trying to make a decision based on the exco. But there's so many layers going up and down that, first of all, time is not of the essence. It should be if you're trying to keep the lights on.
Right.
But unfortunately, it isn't. Second of all, because it's not independently listed or floated on the market, in fact, I was thinking before we started, a great example of how it should be done is the original Vodacom, which had partial government ownership, put on the market, and in fact they had to comply with market regulations. But those private or those state-owned enterprises that are not on the market essentially have this never-ending length of both bailout and time to make the decision.
But here's a question, Andrew.
But I want to just fill in, but the critical thing is, because the masters are basically political and are not held to account against revenues, profits, or anything else at the end of the day, the time taken is too long. The criteria for the selection is not only merit-based. And so at the end of the day, firms like ours certainly end up pulling back because it damages our reputation if an incorrect placement is made and we're involved with the process. And or, on the other side, firms that are servicing those environments are playing some of the tenderpreneuring tricks, where in which case the merit of the individual appointed is not that important. It's merely the fact that you've got a fee and you were involved somehow, and the person they always wanted
is the person who gets the job.
If you think of a company we both worked for once at the same time, SA Breweries, they're almost on principle. They do not have acting appointments.
Correct.
If someone dies or is quickly promoted somewhere or resigns, there's someone ready. They've got it all worked out. You can't do that perfectly, but that's the principle. Why are the state black-owned companies so reluctant to appoint, even when they've got someone in like Brian Molefe who had proved himself?
Correct.
They waited 6 months before confirming it.
So certainly there's an element of fear around it, and certainly both in the acting chair and in the individuals making the decisions, number one, that if we do the wrong thing, it's going to be on my face. And if you're a politician and there's mud on your face, what happens in the next election? You don't cut it. So let's just try and hedge our bets for a bit and do this acting thing. So that's a really bad process. Second of all, I noticed you were talking about corruption earlier, and the problem is corruption thrives when smoke and mirrors and chaos reigns. So by having many people, SAA, for example, has had 6 acting chief executives or semi-permanent chief executives in 3 years. When that happens, no one can track who did what when. And in those states of chaos, so those elements we wouldn't like to see being successful find a way to get things signed where the new incumbent didn't even know it happened, and everything just slows down and becomes an unholy mess.
Another bugbear for me, the rotation of the same people over and over again into the various positions. I mean, I was really, really surprised when Brian Molefe moved to Eskom that it was Siyabonga Gama back coming into Transnet, and then filling Siyabonga's was a former chairman of the SABC. It's the same people. Why is it at that level we can't seem to break through with fresh thinking?
It's a great observation. Okay, certainly, in my opinion, you are now seeing some of the unintended consequences of transformation and BEE. In that, in fact, at that age, 45 plus, if you go back to where those individuals were 20 years ago, we had such a small pool of talented individuals who had had the privilege of either overseas educations or an unencumbered, unpoliticized background. And we're now relying on that very small pool 25 years later. There just aren't enough. So certainly when I looked at the old Eskom, and whether you'd think Brian Damas was successful or unsuccessful, let's leave that out of the debate. But what was very interesting that Paulo Flaherty and Brian Damas actually made quite a good functioning team. And there we had a great example of where quality white talent and quality black talent was used to the best of the ability. But right now, we don't have the volume of individuals with the experience and depth to do it. And that is why we, in many cases, are seeing deployment come to the fore, where individuals who should never have been considered for those roles, been helicoptered or parachuted into them, only to arrive 6 months, 1 year, or 2 years later in a worse position than when they started.
You wanted to talk about black talent.
Yeah, exactly. I wanted to talk about black talent as we're talking about the show, and this idea that black people don't only compete on degrees alone. The workplace is a difficult place if the degree is all you have, and you still have the social cultural shackles that hold you back. You don't have the social capital to tap into, the connected friends and families who understand corporate South Africa and who have parents who go to the Rand Club and have beer with other people.
The Rand Club,
how do you fix this kind of thing?
The failure or the weakness is that what you're asking to do in a very short time is fix a multi-generational problem. Certainly I had privilege as a white man, and I had a father who had 4 degrees. We didn't go to the Rand Club, but what we did do is around the dinner table every night, I was exposed to corporate thinking, to debate, to commercial argument about why one takes one decision versus another. Now, in our previous lives at the mighty SAB, I saw miracles happen. I saw domestic workers or shebeen owners support their children to get the first degree in that family that had ever been done. The problem is, as you've mentioned, is that it's not a complete support process for these individuals. So they are doing the very best they can.
How do they compete when it comes to the headhunting process? You have 2 candidates, same degree and qualifications. When they get into the workplace, do the black candidates excel as much as the white candidates with the same degrees, given all the social cultural deficits that the black people walk in with in the workplace? So
I want to make this, call it 40 to 45-year-old distinction again. That certainly under that age group, by now, I believe it's all equal. If you go and look at the best private schools in the country, the transformation and the number of people in many of these schools, we are starting,
and the top government schools,
but to see good representation of all races in these schools. So certainly from 18 or post being a graduate and up to 40, I certainly believe it's all even, and our transformation policies have worked.
So what's going to happen now is that as that generation comes through, you'll start seeing that social capital deficit decrease as a factor.
It should.
But here's the challenge. What do we do for the next decade. Because you cannot take a 36-year-old and make them chairman of the board now, because they have 20 years of experience still to gain. And if you go and read the great book, Good to Great, the fundamental concept is you can't cheat time. You have to do time at the coalface. And no matter how we accelerate the development, send you to Harvard, do whatever, one needs time. And it's not to say there are not those rare individuals that can catapult themselves through, the Patrices of the world, the Cyrils in his business career, all of them have done it. The problem is not everyone's a Richard Branson or those individuals we've mentioned. So the rest of us just have to walk the path. And that's why I say the unintended consequence now of excluding, and whether you talk Indian, others, foreign inputs into intellectual capital in our economy, then we are going to pay the price for the next decade.
I have thoroughly enjoyed this conversation, and I suspect that there are people who are bristling at some of the things that Andrew has said. But let us know on Twitter. We'll get Andrew back. We'll get another voice. We'll set this up as a debate. He's touched on some really sore points as South Africans, important points nonetheless. So let's keep this conversation going, because I think we've just only scratched the surface. Well done, David, for inviting Andrew.
Thank you. See, it's an old boy network.
I see. It's a white social networks,
we
right?
went to the same school. We worked at the same company.
Good one. A very big thank you to Andrew Woodburn. He's the managing director at Woodburn Mann.